He told me I was just a civilian now. Like the years I gave the missions I buried and the silence I carried meant nothing. But then in the middle of that base, his commanding officer stopped, stared, and saluted me. Right in front of my son. If you've ever been overlooked by your own family, if you've ever been told you no longer matter, stay with me. My name is Cassidy Monroe. I served this country in ways no one was ever meant to know. But now, after years in the shadows, I'm ready to speak. Because this story isn't about revenge. It's about remembrance. And being seen again. They didn't save me a seat. I saw it right away. Before the music started, before the speeches began, before anyone bothered to acknowledge I'd even come, rows of folding chairs were lined with little printed name cards. Dad, Aunt Karen, Coach Morales, even Rachel. Nathan's girlfriend had her name typed neatly in bold serif font. And then there was me. Or rather, there wasn't me. Someone had dragged over an extra chair from the hallway and stuck it in the back off-center near a humming vent and a stack of forgotten programs. No label, no cushion, just metal cold and direct. Like the message. I took the seat without a word. It had been 8 years since I last stood in a room with all of them. Long enough for people to forget where I used to sit. Long enough for silence to grow roots. But not long enough for forgiveness, though I'm not sure they ever thought I deserved any. Nathan was graduating from the academy that afternoon. Top quarter of his class, I'd heard through my sister. The kind of son a family would be proud to show off. I wore a plain gray blouse, something quiet, respectful. I didn't want attention. I just wanted presence. But even that felt like trespassing. As families filed in and greeted one another with hugs and bright faces, no one came to me. My ex-husband nodded once from 3 rows ahead but didn't stand. Karen glanced back then, quickly away. Rachel, bless her, tried to smile, but her eyes flicked toward the vent above me like she was already imagining how cold I must be. They weren't wrong. The metal chair was icy beneath me, and the overhead unit let out a constant low hum. Every once in a while, the vent would sputter and blast a short gust of air directly at my shoulder blades like a reminder that I didn't belong in the frame anymore. I folded my hands in my lap and watched the cadets march in. Their uniforms were crisp, pressed into impossible precision. Their steps synchronized. It reminded me of things I'd tried not to think about for a long time. Nathan came in near the middle of the column. His posture was perfect, his eyes forward, his chest steady. He looked taller than I remembered, though that might have been the shoes, or the distance. For a second my heart lurched. That was my boy. The one I used to carry through airports in a camo sling, whispering lullabies when the jet engines roared too loud for him to sleep. The one who used to write me letters in big, blocky handwriting, signing them, "From your soldier son, age 8. He didn't look my way. He took his place on stage 3rd from the podium, right behind the flag. My eyes followed him, even as the national anthem played, even as we all stood with our hands over our hearts. I felt the ache in my shoulder flare again. A dull, familiar pull from an old ligament injury that never quite healed right. I didn't wince. Pain, like invisibility, becomes tolerable when you carry it long enough. After the opening remarks, the commandant spoke about discipline and honor and tradition. He praised the graduates for upholding a legacy of military excellence, then made a few fatherly jokes about missed PT drills and 5 a.m. inspections. People laughed politely. I didn't. Then Nathan stood. He approached the microphone with a confidence I hadn't seen in him since high school, a commanding presence even in silence. I caught myself holding my breath. He began with a short story, how he'd nearly failed his first field tactics exam and almost quit the program. Everyone laughed, even me. Then came the list of thanks. My father, he began for pushing me to be better every day. Polite applause. My Aunt Karen for all the letters and care packages. More clapping. My girlfriend Rachel for standing by me. Even when I was impossible to be around. A whistle or two from the audience. And then, nothing. Just a beat. A pause. I sat perfectly still. He moved on, right past it, as if there were no other names. No mother in the audience, no woman who'd raised him through deployments and distance and dinners for one, no voice who had coached him through math homework over satellite calls, no hands that packed his first training boots into a shipping box lined with extra socks and a letter he never acknowledged receiving. I blinked twice, but no tears came. I'd already shed those in quieter places. I looked around the room wondering if anyone else noticed, if anyone caught the missing name. But everyone was still smiling, clapping, proud, except me. Then, the doors at the back creaked open. I turned my head along with half the room. A man in full dress uniform stepped in. Tall, broad, with medals that caught the light like polished mirrors. He wasn't young. His hair was silvered at the temples, and his face bore the stillness of someone who had seen enough to no longer be surprised. He didn't rush. His shoes echoed down the aisle in steady cadence. One by one, heads turned. Even the commandant seemed to straighten his posture as the man passed. He stopped near the middle of the hall, eyes scanning the crowd slowly. I thought he might be looking for someone on stage. But then his gaze landed on me. And stayed there. He didn't smile. He lifted his hand in a perfect salute. To me. I didn't move right away. Around me, the audience hushed. You could hear the low squeak of chairs as people leaned to whisper. I heard someone behind me say, "Who is she?" But I didn't answer. I just met his eyes and nodded. Just once, low and precise. He held the salute for a breath longer, then lowered his hand and turned. Without a word, he found the nearest empty seat and sat. The room didn't recover quickly. Nathan's mouth parted slightly. His eyes darted toward me just for a second before he looked back at the microphone. His hand gripped the edge of the podium. The commandant shuffled his notes. Karen looked back again, this time fully turned in her chair. Even Rachel's expression was uncertain. No one asked anything out loud, but the question hung in the air. And in that silence, something shifted. They didn't know who I was, but someone did. And now they were beginning to wonder. I didn't plan to stay for the reception. In fact, I hadn't planned to stay past the national anthem. But after the salute, after that quiet detonation of truth in the middle of a polished, perfect ceremony, I didn't want to move too fast. Not because I was afraid, just because I wanted to watch how they'd look at me now. And they did. The officer who saluted me didn't speak again. He simply folded his hands and sat through the remainder of the event like he hadn't just turned a spotlight on someone the room had conveniently forgotten. Colonel Wyatt. I hadn't seen him in nearly a decade. The last time we were reviewing casualty projections over a broken map lit by a single lantern during a dust storm in eastern Syria. He was younger then, fewer creases around the eyes, but I'd recognize his posture anywhere. Shoulders like concrete, and eyes like a man who remembered every name he couldn't save. Back then, I'd been his mission coordinator. Officially, I was nothing more than a civilian strategist. Unofficially, my name was attached to every route, every extraction, every decision that made it possible for him to bring his team back alive. We worked in shadows. There were no photos, no medals, just outcomes, and now he'd walked into a hall full of brass and banners, looked right past the stage, and saluted me. Nathan didn't say anything at first. After the final cadet marched out and the band packed up their instruments, he stayed near the podium, avoiding eye contact. His father approached him with a hand on the shoulder. Aunt Karen fussed with Rachel's corsage. No one spoke to me. I stood quietly in the corner next to a table of half-eaten sheet cake and lukewarm punch. When Nathan finally approached, his face was stiff, unreadable. The way mine used to be before mission briefings. "That man," he said. "The officer. Why did he salute you?" I took a slow sip of punch. It tasted like cherry-flavored cough syrup. "He must have mistaken me for someone else," I said. Nathan didn't believe me. But he didn't push. Not then. He just looked away, jaw clenched, before Rachel called him over for photos. I didn't stay to see the slideshow or the family toast. I slipped out the side exit, walked 2 blocks to the rental car, and sat behind the wheel for 5 full minutes before starting the engine. There's a kind of silence that only shows up after years of pretending not to care. It filled the car like steam pressing into the corners of my throat. I didn't cry. I hadn't in years. But something ached, something old. At the motel, the room was dim and spare, just the way I'd asked. No digital assistants, no connected TVs, just analog locks and drawn blinds. I double-checked the latch peeled off my shoes and sat at the small desk where I'd left the old device hidden inside a false-bottom toiletries case. A hardened tablet, military-issued, disguised beneath a sleeve of toothpaste and folded socks. It took a moment to boot. The encryption protocols were still intact. Passwords etched into muscle memory. Fingerprint recognition approved on the first scan. The screen blinked. A single message waited in the private channel reserved for classified legacy operations. A red flag header. Pentagon internal, dated 2 hours earlier. My heart slowed, then surged. Archive breach alert, Tier 5 legacy access attempt detected. Codename Hatch Raven. Beneath it a name, my name. Not just Monroe. Commander Cassidy Monroe. No rank, no clearance tags. Just the identifier that once meant I had a team under my watch and blood under my fingernails. The system logged the time, the IP origin, and the classification level. The attempt had triggered a dormant trace key. An embedded signature woven into a restricted archive I thought had been buried for good. Whoever accessed it didn't just skim the surface. They'd gone deep, too deep for it to be random. And that meant one of 2 things. Someone was either trying to resurrect a ghost, or someone was trying to erase one. I leaned back in the chair screen, still glowing, and stared at the wall like it might offer answers. The air in the room felt thinner. Old instincts stretched awake in my spine. For 15 years I'd lived like a name no longer needed. I had disappeared the way the government wanted me to, quietly, without ceremony, without trace. But the thing about shadows is, they remember you. Especially when someone tries to drag them into the light, and someone just did. They always called me a strategist, but they never told me how much it would cost to think for yourself. I wasn't special forces, I didn't carry a rifle or breach doors at dawn. I didn't wear insignias or stand for roll call. I didn't even get a proper send-off when I left. But every route those soldiers walked, every safe house they reached, every convoy that made it out alive, someone had to build that path. That was me. I worked behind the wall of signals, maps, and decisions no one ever wanted to admit were made. I operated out of a mobile joint command cell inside CJSOTF Syria. A 4-screen workstation, a burn phone, and a reinforced bunker in the middle of a shifting battlefield. My title was Sanitized GS-14 Strategic Operations Officer Civilian Appointment. But I answered directly to commanders who made life and death calls every day, and sometimes I was the one whispering which option to take. Over time, they stopped seeing me as just a civilian. I wasn't one of them. But I wasn't not one of them either. I lived in the middle space, respected, useful, and completely expendable. Hatch Raven was the last operation I touched. Maybe the last one I was ever supposed to. It wasn't supposed to be a mess, like buying. The targets were confirmed a logistics cell running communications and smuggled explosives through the Euphrates corridor. We had eyes on 3 safe houses, a convoy trail, and a compound near al-Bahira. Intel said the insurgents were planning a chain of IED attacks along a NATO convoy route. It was urgent, deadly, and politically delicate. Perfect for someone like me. Someone who could plan without being seen. The drone feed showed the compound was active. Thermal imaging confirmed heat signatures. The target was inside. I gave the go-ahead for the first sweep. Our units moved closer. Then I noticed something. It wasn't in the data. It wasn't on the brief. It was just something that caught my eye in the background. A small figure darting past a broken wall, then another. I ordered the camera to zoom. A boy, maybe 8, dust-covered, barefoot, holding onto what looked like an older man, limping. They were inside the blast radius. It didn't make sense. Civilians weren't supposed to be there. We had confirmation it had been cleared. But something about the posture, how the boy stayed pressed to the man's side, not panicked, just anchored, told me he wasn't bait. He was real. And the strike was 15 seconds away. I should have confirmed the hit. Instead, I froze the feed. Abort, I said. That one word echoed across 5 different channels. The silence afterward was instant. I rerouted 2 squads to ground check the site. My team protested. Too risky, too slow. But I'd already made the call. We held fire. We waited. They found 17 civilians in the eastern wing of the compound, women, children, and elderly couple. The insurgents had fled hours earlier, probably tipped off. They had used the civilians as cover betting we wouldn't wait long enough to see them. They were almost right. We evacuated the civilians and called in medical, but the delay gave enemy scouts time to regroup. On the way out, an ambush caught one of our flanks. 2 wounded, 1 extraction delayed. We lost our element of surprise. No one died, on either side. But the report didn't say that. It used words like compromised timeline command, indecision, loss of mission confidence. They didn't court-martial me. That would have required public scrutiny. Instead, they scheduled a meeting. 3-star 2 lawyers, 1 memo. Your judgment call, while ethically understandable, presents a challenge for strategic cohesion going forward. They said, this isn't about punishment, it's about optics. They offered me an honorable release. Tier 2 clearance suspension, soft exit, no statement, no black mark, just silence. I asked what happened if I refused. They said I wouldn't be reassigned, I'd just be stuck. Unwelcome. So I signed. 1 line at the bottom of a form was all it took to end 16 years of service. They revoked my credentials, shut off my access to the command network, and archived my name into a restricted file system. It didn't even ping my personal email. That night, I packed everything I owned into a regulation duffel and walked off base under a gray sky. When I landed back home, no one was waiting. My sister sent me a key to her guest room. My father asked if I'd finally had enough of the soldier thing. My son didn't even come to the airport. He was 16 then. Angry Sharp, still trying to figure out who to blame for a fractured childhood. I didn't tell him what happened. He didn't ask. I suppose that's how the myth took root. Mom quit. It was easier to believe that than to believe the truth that I was removed because I refused to let a child die for the sake of political neatness. And maybe I let that story fester. Maybe I thought with time they'd realize there was more to it. But the longer I stayed quiet, the more permanent the lie became. Now, years later, someone had opened the file I thought would never see daylight again. Hatch Raven wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The records were sealed behind 6 levels of classification. You couldn't even search for it without a rotating clearance key. But someone had reached into the dark and pulled at a thread. And when that thread snapped, it tripped the alert buried in the code. A shadow trace that only a few of us even knew existed. There were no names listed in the alert, just mine. Monroe C. It wasn't a mistake. No one looks for ghosts by accident. And I had a feeling that someone wasn't just looking. They were getting ready to rewrite. Or erase. The alert didn't say who. It never does. Not directly. Just an IP string, a server tag, and a timestamp. A breadcrumb trail only someone like me would know how to follow. I hadn't run a secure trace in years. Not since the last classified environment I logged into disappeared into a digital graveyard. But some muscle memories never fade. My fingers still knew the rhythm of the keys, still trusted the silence between code injections. It took me 20 minutes to bypass the network masking, and another 5 to freeze. Because the access didn't come from a hostile node. It didn't come from a foreign ping or a press leak or a political informant with too much clearance. It came from a Department of Defense academic shell tied to a military education facility, an internal request. I narrowed the timestamp, checked the location metadata. One cross-reference later, I stared at the university's name in full: Rockmont Military Academy. Nathan's school. It didn't make sense at first. I reran the logs. Thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe someone spoofed a credential or hijacked an account. It wouldn't be the first time a foreign actor used a stateside pipeline to reach something buried. But the credentials hadn't been faked. They were clean, scanned in from an Academy library terminal authenticated under a student number. I knew that number. I used to write it on health forms and school insurance. It was Nathan. My son had accessed the Hatch Raven archive. I stared at the screen for a long time, heart thudding, not with fear, but with something colder. Something that felt like betrayal, even though I knew he couldn't possibly understand what he'd touched. The system had responded to his access the way it was designed to, with alarm. Not because he meant harm, but because what he'd found wasn't meant to exist in the first place. I checked the file path he opened, a portion of the field logistics report embedded in a decommissioned operations folder for research reference. It was one of the few remaining pieces that hadn't been scrubbed clean, probably because it wasn't labeled under the code name, just a number hidden inside a training module about mission breakdowns. He must have been looking for real-world examples of strategic friction in asymmetric warfare. That was one of the common capstone topics at his academy. And that phrase, strategic friction, summed up Hatch Raven almost too well. I thought back to the moment at his graduation. The salute, the way he asked me why it happened, eyes searching but still closed. Was he already writing the paper then? Was he hoping I'd offer something? Or was it just coincidence I didn't know? All I knew was that he'd pulled the pin on a live grenade without realizing it. Because the moment he accessed the archive, it tripped the embedded protocol. Storm trace. A kill switch signal buried inside the raw logs of the Hatch Raven operation. It was designed to alert former operatives that a dormant file had been exposed. But it did more than that. It activated red flag protocols across the review board. Someone saw the breach. And someone was already moving. I cross-checked the network logs again. A new entry had appeared, a document flagged for deletion. Not redaction, not restriction. Deletion. Full removal from the internal system. The title, Raven Mission Log. Forward Command Synthesis. That was the core summary I'd written myself, the only existing field narrative that hadn't been filtered through committee language. It wasn't polished. It wasn't pretty. But it was true. And now it was one line away from being erased forever. Someone wanted it gone. Not because of what Nathan saw, but because of what it could lead to. A full exposure. A reckoning. I sat back, breathing through my teeth. Nathan hadn't meant to cause this. He was digging through research, following a hunch, probably looking for a paper topic that felt edgy and impressive. But he didn't know what he'd found. He didn't know that touching Hatch Raven would pull me out of the grave they put me in. And now, someone was trying to bury me again. I didn't call him. Not yet. I needed to know more. Not just what he saw, but who else had seen that he saw it. Whether his name had been added to the watch list, whether someone higher up was preparing a response, or a silencing. I reactivated a few more access keys, deep ones, skeleton level. Ones I'd held onto out of habit and fear, and one by one they began to unlock. The system remembered me, even if the world didn't. My screen filled with code routing tables, purge schedules, a list of flagged operations under review. There it was. Operation Hatch Raven, pending data dissolution. A countdown had already begun. 48 hours before permanent deletion. Someone had taken Nathan's accidental click as an excuse to finish what they started years ago, erasing the truth. and with it every name I'd tried to protect. There was no more room for waiting, no more silence, because this time if they buried the mission, they'd have to bury me alive. I read the internal memo 3 times, hoping I was wrong. The header looked official. Departmental Review Brief Subcommittee on Special Operations. Just another PDF buried in bureaucratic language. But the deeper I read, the colder it felt. They called Hatch Raven a strategic misstep. They called me an unverified civilian contributor. They called our extraction a compromised asset recovery. Nowhere did it say 17 civilians had been pulled from a collapsing compound. Nowhere did it say we saved a child clutching his dying uncle. Nowhere did it say I made a decision that Field Command hadn't dared to make because I saw what they didn't. Instead, the new language reframed everything. It was polished professional and poisonous. And at the bottom of the summary, I saw the signature Senator Mark Ledlow Oversight Lead Special Warfare Policy Committee. I remembered that name. He wasn't part of the military. Not really. He'd never worn boots on sand or smelled the aftershock of a blast. But he made his career off the military, shaking hands with generals on photo ops, voting for bigger defense budgets, then cutting every policy that opened doors for women to lead in combat roles. Years ago, I'd read his speeches behind closed doors. Biology does not bend to ideology, he once said on the Senate floor, arguing against integrated special operations teams. Emotion clouds command decisions, he said during a debate on opening strategic roles to civilian women. And now he had the excuse he'd been waiting for. One old file cracked open by accident. One mission. Mine. He was rewriting the record not to understand it, but to weaponize it. I needed help. Not a defense team, not a lawyer. Someone who knew what happened. Someone who was there. I started reaching out. Quietly. Carefully. The old channels weren't usable anymore, so I found back doors. Secure inboxes, dead drop forums. Most replies were silence. A few came back cold. One said, "Let it go." Another, "We signed for a reason." But then one name replied with just 3 words. When and where. Ellie Tran. We met on a Tuesday afternoon in a quiet Vietnamese cafe tucked between a dry cleaner and a hardware store. Norfolk was still humid that time of year, and the air smelled like black coffee and fried shallots. Ellie was already seated when I arrived. She looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe it was the turtleneck or the way she held her spoon with both hands, but her eyes hadn't changed. Sharp, calm, scanning everything. I sat. She didn't smile. Just looked me over like I was a familiar piece of equipment being reactivated. "You saw the memo?" I asked. She nodded. "They're calling it a failure now. Said you hesitated. Cost lives." I scoffed. "They cut the civilian rescue out completely." Ellie's mouth twitched. Not a smile. Something colder. "They always hated that we didn't fail," she said. "You gave them the story they feared. A woman making the right call in the worst moment. They can't afford for that to be true." We sipped our coffee in silence for a minute. Neither of us needed to explain how this worked. We'd both lived it. Orders rewritten. Debriefs sanitized. Files buried. "I still have the Raven logs," Ellie said softly. "Unredacted. From the tactical node." I looked up. How encrypted archive. Buried under 3 layers. But I knew someday they'd come looking for blood, not truth. I nodded, breath held. "If I request a formal hearing, will you testify I'll confirm the timeline, the mission intent, the actual casualty count? But Cassidy, if you do this, you're visible again. They'll come for you. Press, Senate, everyone." I looked into my cup. Steam curled like fog from a past I hadn't dared touch in years. I'd rather be attacked for the truth I said than erased by a lie. Ellie leaned in. Her voice dropped lower. "They won't just try to discredit you. They'll go after your family. Your son. Are you ready for that?" "No," I said honestly, "but I'm doing it anyway." That night, back at the motel, I turned off every light but the one over the desk. My laptop screen glowed like a confession waiting to be written. The cursor blinked at the top of a blank file. Subject line: Petition for hearing. Operation Hatch Raven. I typed slowly at first, then faster. Every sentence weighed twice in my mind before landing on the page. No dramatics, no anger, just truth documented, ordered clear. I am requesting an internal hearing before the Department of Defense Oversight Committee regarding the misrepresentation and attempted deletion of operational materials relating to Operation Hatch Raven. I served as the Civilian Strategic Coordinator for this mission under CJSOTF Authority GS-14 classification. I witnessed the operation firsthand. I made the field decision in question. I am prepared to present timeline evidence, original communications, and corroborating witness testimony. I request this hearing not for recognition, but for record integrity. This operation must not be rewritten. I saved the file, uploaded it through an encrypted tunnel, signed with my original chain ID. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, and when it hit 100%, I let the silence return. I didn't expect a reply that night. I didn't expect a thank you. But I hoped, quietly, bitterly, that somewhere someone on that committee would stop and wonder, why is this woman willing to risk everything just to keep her name attached to a mission no one talks about? The answer was simple. Because they weren't just erasing a file. They were erasing a moment when I did the right thing, and no one else had the courage to. And if I didn't stop them now, I wouldn't just lose my place in the story. I'd lose the story itself. The confirmation had barely finished loading on my screen when the consequences arrived. Fast, quiet, and personal. Hearing scheduled. Official inquiry pending. Your designation witness. That was all it said. But 20 minutes later, my son's name came through a different channel. Nathan Monroe, ROTC track suspended. Access under review. Subject to internal security audit. No call, no warning. Just an alert wrapped in legal language delivered to my inbox like a second wave of shrapnel. He called me an hour later. The edge in his voice wasn't just anger. It was disorientation. Why didn't you tell me what I was touching? He said, no greeting. Do you have any idea what this is doing to me? I didn't know you were digging, I said quietly. His breath was sharp. I wasn't digging. I was researching for a paper. That's it. One keystroke, and now my career's on pause, and everyone's acting like I triggered a war. I'm sorry, I said. You accessed something classified. It triggered a legacy protocol I didn't build, but I know exactly what it means. There was a pause. Then I Googled Hatch Raven. Nothing. It doesn't exist. It wasn't supposed to. He exhaled. A long, bitter exhale. All these years I thought I knew who I was, who you were, that we were just a normal military family. A little fractured, maybe. But normal. We were never normal, I said. You just didn't know. Silence. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. But before he hung up, he asked, almost whispering, so what does that make me? A kid raised on lies. I didn't answer in time. The call ended. Later it was my ex-husband. Same theme, different tone. You've done enough damage, Cass, he said flatly. You should have left all this in the past. He accessed the file by accident, I said. You know that. I don't care how it happened. I care that you're making this public. That our son is caught in a mess no one even understands. He was never good with nuance. You always hated that I never gave you a neat story to tell at barbecues, I said. Now it's finally blowing back. He sighed like I was being dramatic. You don't have to torch everything just to prove a point. I'm not proving anything, I said. I'm telling the truth. Click. It was the same ending to every conversation we ever had. No discussion. Just done. That evening I drove out to my parents' house. I hadn't been back in over a year. The hedges were still trimmed to perfection, porch light glowing warm yellow. From the outside it looked like peace. Inside it was quiet. Too quiet. My mother answered the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Well, she said, stepping aside. It's been a while. My father was in the living room, reclined in his chair. TV muted arms crossed like a court martial waiting for testimony. Is it true? He asked. All this about hearings and old missions. You're making the paper trail again. They started it, I said. I'm just not letting them finish it. My mother folded her arms. Cassidy, you have a life now. A son. Why can't you let the past go? The past isn't gone, I said. It's being twisted. And my name is being used as proof of a failure that never happened. They exchanged a look. The same look they always used when I didn't play by their script. I scanned the walls. The family honors shelf was just as I remembered. Framed medals, old black and white portraits in uniform, my brother's deployment photos, my sister's mission commendations. But nothing of me. Not even my boot camp photo, I said. My mother didn't look up. It didn't match the display. Of course it didn't. I hadn't matched anything since I was 19. They never asked what I actually did. They told people I coordinated logistics. Once I overheard my father tell a neighbor I worked in military spreadsheets. I sent letters from forward bases. Handwritten, careful. They never wrote back. I once called home after a teammate died. My mother changed the subject to my sister's wedding. It wasn't that they didn't care. They just didn't want me to exist in that way. I stood, looked at them both for a long time. The room didn't change. The air didn't shift. You never asked what I saw, I said, what I lost. You only asked if it would embarrass you, if it would make Thanksgiving awkward. My father looked away. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. I'm not coming back here, I said. Not until you see me as more than a shadow in your hallway. I walked out. It was almost midnight by the time I got back to the motel. The parking lot was empty. My room was colder than I remembered. I dropped my bag, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the phone. Then it buzzed. One message. From Nathan. If this is who you are, show me. 7 words. No warmth. No apology. But something cracked. He'd never sent anything like that before. Never reached back after a fight. Never asked to see me. Not the mother, but the person. I didn't reply. Not yet. Because showing him would take more than a message. It would take standing in front of the world under oath and saying, this is who I am. This is what I chose. And this is why I never let them forget. I always thought silence was safer than exposure. But now I understood something deeper. Silence invites deletion. And I was done being erased. The cafe was quieter this time. Same little table tucked by the window, but the hum of the espresso machine seemed distant. Ellie didn't bother with pleasantries. She opened her bag, pulled out a compact black hard drive, and placed it between us like it was a relic. No label, no logo. Just cold weight in a plastic shell. You said you wanted truth, she said. This is everything I saved. I picked it up. It was no bigger than my palm, but I felt the density of years packed inside. Uncensored emails, field dispatches, encrypted routing logs. And one more thing. There's a clip, Ellie said, voice quiet. Body cam footage. From your team's recon unit. It shows the moment. She didn't need to say which one. I knew. The abort call, I asked. She nodded. My breath caught. I thought that feed was lost. The system wiped it. It was, she said. But a technician made a backup before the purge thought it was part of a training file. I found it buried in a maintenance node 6 years ago. I held on to it, just in case someone ever tried what they're doing now. I looked at her. Really looked. Ellie's face was pale, lips pressed tight. This wasn't just information. It was ammunition. And using it came with risk. You're sure about this? I asked. No, she said, but I'm sure it's real. And that makes it matter. I thanked her and left. Back at the motel, I closed every curtain, booted up my secured laptop. An ancient thing I kept disconnected from every network. I plugged in the drive. The folder structure was clean. Ellie always organized everything like a war room. Date unit node. I clicked through the Raven logs slowly, like flipping through old letters you're afraid to touch. And then I saw it. 2011 09 14 RVN KM03 MMOV. No flashy title, just a timestamp. I double-clicked. The footage was dark at first. Dust in the lens, crackling audio. A soldier's breath heavy in the mic. Then the camera panned over a shattered wall. Smoke curled upward in the far distance. Radio chatter crisscrossed like overlapping thoughts. And then I came into frame. Helmet on tactical vest stained. My right hand gripped a radio unit. My voice came through clear. Strike authorization on hold. Repeating abort. More chatter. Command confirm. Strike cleared 20 seconds ago. Negative. I've got thermal movement in quadrant 3. Civilian-sized heat signatures. Abort confirmed. The lens zoomed toward the structure. There. Just inside the northeast wing. A blur of shapes. One tall limping, one small. The smaller one turned just for a second, and you could make out the unmistakable shape of a child's body. My voice again firm but quiet. They're still in there. We hold. Another pause. Then a sigh from someone off screen. You're on the hook for this, Monroe. I remember how that line stung the first time. Watching it now, it still did. But it wasn't shame I felt. It was clarity. The clip ended. I sat back in my chair, heart drumming against my ribs. The room felt too still. Like time itself had stopped to ask, now what I could have kept it. Buried it again. Said I didn't find anything usable. It would have been easy. But easy hadn't saved those 17 people that day. And it wasn't going to save the truth now. I called Ellie. She picked up on the second ring. I watched it, I said. It's clean. Real. She was quiet. Are you sure you want to submit it? She asked. It'll make you a target again. They're already aiming, I said. Might as well give them something worth shooting at. That night I opened a blank document. My hands hovered above the keyboard longer than I expected. This wasn't just paperwork. It was resurrection. I began typing. Witness statement. Cassidy Monroe. Submitted to Department of Defense Oversight Committee. Subject operation, Hatch Raven. I am submitting the following statement as a first-hand witness and primary operations strategist assigned to Hatch Raven, conducted under Joint Special Operations Authorization in September 2011. During the mission's third phase, I authorized the delay of an aerial strike based on live thermal imaging, identifying the presence of civilians within the target compound. That decision was mine. I made it with full awareness of the operational risk. The footage enclosed supports this call. This is not submitted to justify, only to document. History can argue the merits, but it will not argue whether it happened. I attached the clip, signed with my full name, added the original date of my assignment. Then I encrypted the packet and routed it through the federal evidence chain. No alias, no proxy. My name was at the top of every field. When the final screen blinked, transmission complete. I just sat there. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel brave. I felt seen. An hour later, I received a confirmation email, testimony received. Clip verified. Hearing will proceed with Ms. Monroe as primary witness. I read it twice, then closed the laptop, then closed my eyes. The story I lived in silence was finally in the light, and this time the record wouldn't erase me. It would carry me forward. The base hadn't changed. Gray walls, razor-straight walkways. The low hum of maintenance vehicles in the background mixing with gull sounds and distant cadence calls. It felt like muscle memory, the kind that returns the moment your boots hit military concrete again. But I wasn't here in uniform. I was here in memory. I walked to the security gate, handed over my temporary clearance. The young sergeant checked the tablet scrolled, then furrowed his brow. Name again, ma'am, Cassidy Monroe. Civilian clearance. Witness category. He tapped something, eyes flicking over the screen. Then he glanced up. You're not on the speakers list. No, I said. But I'll be speaking. After a pause, he nodded me through. The hearing hall looked like every other room in the military, designed to look neutral. Pale beige walls, blue-gray carpet, aluminum chairs set out in perfect rows. The temperature was 2 degrees too cold. A flag stood in every corner. I was directed, politely but firmly, to sit in the rear observation row. That wasn't new. I'd spent my whole career seated just out of view. Around me, people began filing in. Some wore suits, some dress blues, most committee staffers or aides. A few younger officers looked around like they weren't sure if they belonged. One of them glanced at me, eyes catching on something. My posture, maybe. My stillness. But then he looked away. The chairwoman entered at exactly 0900. She didn't need to speak loudly. The room responded to her presence the way seasoned troops respond to a respected commander. She opened a folder. Before we begin, this committee will read the formal review summary of Operation Hatch Raven, as submitted to oversight by Senator Mark Ledlow's office. Her voice was even, but the words that followed felt like vinegar. Incomplete chain of command. Delay of pre-approved action. No formal commendation submitted. After-action report redacted due to ambiguity. I sat still, hands on my lap, heartbeat slow. They were summarizing 15 days of my life into a paragraph shaped like failure. And then our civilian witness, Ms. Monroe, has submitted original mission documentation for consideration. She is now invited to present her materials. Every chair turned slightly. Some craned necks. Others blinked. Me. That name, I walked forward. Steadily, every step deliberate, not slow. Just anchored. When I reached the front table, the AV tech offered a curt nod. I handed him the encrypted drive. I'm not here for glory, I said. I'm here for correction. He plugged in the file. The screen flickered. The lights dimmed slightly. And the clip began. The footage was grainy, recorded on a helmet cam. Static twitched across the screen. The recon soldier's breath crackled in the mic. The lens turned, landing on a half-crushed stone compound. Smoke drifted from a collapsed arch. My voice rang out. Quiet but firm. Abort strike. I repeat, do not fire. Civilians in zone. There was silence. Then a channel hissed to life. Raven. 3. You are clear. Why are we holding look northeast quadrant, I said. Human signatures. Multiple. Confirmed non-combatants. The lens panned slowly. And there they were. Shadowed figures huddled near a collapsed beam. One small, one staggering. A child. The room gasped. My voice again. I'm taking responsibility. We hold. The video ended. Silence took over. Not uncomfortable silence, but recognition silence. No one moved. Then from the third row, a young Marine lieutenant stood. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He saluted. Crisp, sharp, deliberate. The chair creaked beneath him as he stood alone. Then another officer rose. Then a woman in the back corner. Then someone in civilian dress. But with a pin on his lapel that told me everything, former Joint Task Force. One by one, without order, they stood. Not in unison, but in momentum. The kind you can't fake. Senator Ledlow shifted uncomfortably, cleared his throat. This, he said loudly, is not protocols, it's performance. Theatrics. This woman hasn't held a title in years. The committee chair didn't even turn her head. She never stopped holding it, she said. You just never printed it. At that moment, the overhead screen refreshed. My service record appeared, line by line. Strategic Operations Civilian Grade GS-14, Joint Authorization Level 3, Operation Hatch Raven, Field Coordinator, Commendation Recommendation, Deferred, Disciplinary Action, None. And then at the bottom, Status Witness, Record Reinstated. The senator sat straighter. A few aides typed quickly, almost nervously. Ledlow's face paled just enough to notice. The hearing moved on after that, but the tone had changed. They didn't interrupt me when I answered. They didn't question the legitimacy of my clip. They didn't call me emotional or unstable or too far removed from the field. They let me speak. And when the chair finally adjourned the session, I turned to leave, and saw him. In the very last row, partially hidden behind a column, Nathan. No uniform, no reaction, just watching. I stopped. Our eyes met. He didn't look away. And in that silence between mother and son, I finally saw what I'd been waiting for. Not approval, not pride, but recognition. He saw me, not as someone who quit, not as a shadow, but as the woman who stood, spoke, and stayed standing. And for now, that was enough. Ask ChatGPT. They said it would be just a debrief, a formality, but I knew better. The kind of meetings that come without a calendar invite are never just formality. A junior officer delivered the summons by hand. He didn't look me in the eye, just handed over the envelope and mumbled, "Room Echo 12, ma'am. Now." The hallway to Echo 12 was colder than the rest of the building, not just in temperature but in presence. The kind of silence that hums beneath fluorescent lights and makes your steps feel too loud. The room was stark. One long table, no insignia on the walls, no screens. A single pitcher of water sweating in the center like it too was nervous. 6 people waited inside. 2 wore suits, 2 wore dress uniforms, and 2 looked like they'd long since stopped needing name tags. Women in their 50s, maybe 60s, gray hair pulled back, eyes steady. One of them nodded when I entered. "Ms. Monroe, please have a seat." I did. No one smiled. The woman on the left, Lieutenant General Shaw, according to the silver tag on her breast pocket, spoke first. "We appreciate your cooperation. You've reignited something we thought had been put to rest." Her voice wasn't unkind, but it wasn't supportive either. It was the tone of someone managing a crisis they didn't cause, but now had to clean up. The civilian in the middle opened a manila folder. No laptop, no notes, just paper. Old school like all sensitive things tend to be. We've reviewed the footage. No one is questioning its authenticity, but the narrative it introduces complicates a lot. I let the silence stretch. He continued, "There are those in oversight who now view you as a liability, not for what you did then, but for what you chose to show now." Another one, possibly Defense Intelligence, slid a document across the table. It stopped in front of me. 4 pages, legal headers, redacted footnotes, a deal. "If you agree to reclassify the Hatch-Raven materials, he said the department will reinstate your clearances as honorably inactive, retroactively commend your service, and halt all review proceedings tied to your son's file." I didn't touch the paper. "You're offering me erasure," I said, "in exchange for erasing you from the mess." He didn't blink. "We're offering you peace." I looked down. My name at the top of the document. Nathan's listed under Secondary Impact Resolution. It wasn't new to me. I'd seen deals like this before. I'd written them. Back when I was stationed at Base Command in Kandahar, I helped draft a confidentiality package for a whistleblower who found irregular drone logs. I watched him sign his name. Watched his shoulders drop like he'd swallowed a concrete pill. I remembered thinking, that won't be me. And yet here I was. "You trained me to clean up other people's truths," I said quietly. "And now you're asking me to clean up my own." General Shaw spoke again. "We're offering you a safe landing." "But only if I stay quiet," I said. One of the civilians interjected. "You're not being gagged. The record still exists, just not publicly." "That's the same as erasure," I replied. "It's silence with a certificate." The second woman, taller, darker eyes, who hadn't spoken until now, leaned forward. "Miss Monroe," she said, "you've already made your impact. The hearing. It'll ripple. But if you keep pushing, it'll be political. and people will make you the symbol instead of the story." I looked at her, then at the document again. "If I sign this," I said slowly, "then the next woman in my position learns that silence is still the price of being allowed to belong." She didn't argue, just looked down at her folded hands. General Shaw finally spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "Then I hope you're ready for what that means." I nodded. I've been ready since the day I walked out of that compound with 17 civilians alive and no support on the airwaves. I slid the paper back across the table. Didn't sign it. Didn't ask what came next. I simply stood. "You just gave up your parachute," one of the suits said under his breath. "No," I replied, steady. "I just stopped pretending I needed one." The walk out was longer than I remembered. Or maybe my steps were just heavier. Outside, the air smelled like sun on steel and rubber. 2 young soldiers passed by in clean fatigues laughing about something on a phone screen. One of them gave me a casual nod. Respectful, but distant. He had no idea who I was. That's the thing about being forgotten. You blend in just enough to be harmless again. Back at the motel, I locked the door, sat on the edge of the bed. It was the same bed I'd collapsed on a week ago with a file in my lap and silence screaming in my ears. Now there was just quiet, a new kind, one I'd earned. And then came the knock, soft, 3 taps, like someone testing the weight of a moment. I stood, opened the door. Nathan. His face was unreadable. Not angry, not proud, just present. He didn't ask if he could come in. He didn't say anything clever. He just met my eyes and said, "Can we talk?" And for the first time since I'd come back, I felt something shift. Not in the world, not in the record, but in me. I was ready to be heard, even if it started with just him. He sat with his shoulders hunched forward, not quite leaning back, not quite ready to settle in. Nathan had always carried his discomfort in the way he held his body, like he was never sure how much space he was allowed to take up. The motel room was quiet except for the hum of the old ceiling fan spinning just slightly off balance, making a soft ticking noise that matched the weight between us. He hadn't said much after I let him in, just looked around like he was trying to make sense of me now that the shape of me had changed. Finally, he asked the question I knew would come. "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked down at my hands resting on my lap. They felt different lately. Not older, just more certain. Like they'd finally landed where they were supposed to be. Because it never felt like the right time, I said. And then too much time passed, and the space between what you knew and what I lived just got wider. He nodded slowly but didn't look up. "I used to think you left because you didn't want us," he said. "Because we were too heavy to carry." That hit like a punch I didn't brace for. I turned toward the window, the blinds letting in slivers of light from the motel parking lot. A truck engine rumbled outside, then faded. The room went still again. "I didn't leave to escape you," I said. "I left to protect what I believed in. And then I stayed gone because I didn't know how to come back without tearing open everything I had buried." He sat with that for a while. No anger on his face, just grief. The quiet kind that settles into your bones when you realize the story you told yourself was only half the truth. "You know, I used to tell people you were a contractor overseas," he said with a tired smile. "I made up whole backstories. One time I even said you built airfields. I wanted so badly for you to be something I could explain. And I wanted so badly for you to be someone I didn't put in the line of fire just by existing." I whispered. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small. A laminated program from the hearing. My name was listed at the bottom as a witness. No rank, no context. Just black text on a white line. "I kept this," he said. "I don't know why. Maybe because it felt like the first time someone else saw you." I blinked. Hard. We didn't hug. That's never how we worked. But I sat down beside him. Our knees almost touched. For a moment, we just sat in the quiet together, and somehow that was more honest than anything we had ever said before. 3 weeks later, I was back in Jacksonville. The invitation came through the local VA office, a community event at the old hall downtown, Veterans Appreciation Week. They were honoring local service members and had asked if I would speak. I almost declined. Not because I was afraid, just because I wasn't sure if I had anything left to say. But then I remembered the girl with the paper flower, and the way that lieutenant had stood without being told. I remembered the feeling of standing on the hearing floor with the truth finally unburied. So I said yes. The hall looked exactly the same as it had when I was 12. Wooden floors worn down by 1,000 ceremonies, rows of metal folding chairs, paper banners taped across the front stage, a man in a cap reading a newspaper in the back corner. I wore a simple gray blouse. No medals, no ribbons, just a single silver chain with a ring threaded through it, the one I had worn under my uniform every year I was deployed. When they called my name, I walked up slowly, not to stall, just to feel it. The microphone squeaked as I adjusted it. The crowd quieted. I didn't have a speech, I just had what was true. I used to think the worst thing that could happen was being forgotten, I said. But I was wrong. The worst is realizing you've become invisible to the people who once knew you best. I paused, looked around the room. Some eyes were already wet, some hands clenched. But the beautiful thing about being invisible is that when someone finally sees you again, it changes everything. I saw my mother in the front row, her hands folded in her lap. My father beside her, not blinking. Nathan stood in the back, again leaning against the wall like he belonged there now. After the speech, people lined up to shake my hand. Most didn't say much, just nodded. A few hugged me tight without words. One older man saluted. I returned it without hesitation. Then a little girl stepped forward. She looked no older than 9. Freckles, ponytail, a plastic medal around her neck. She held out a crumpled paper flower. "I want to be like you," she whispered. Quiet and brave. I bent down so we were eye to eye. "You don't need the world to know who you are," I told her. "Just make sure you do." She nodded like she understood more than most adults ever would. Later that evening, I found myself in front of the family wall. It used to hold only the men, Granddad in World War II, in world. Dad in the Gulf, my brother in Afghanistan. Now there was a new frame, same size, black border, my photo in uniform, no caption, just a date and a place. My mother stood beside me. Her fingers touched the glass. "I'm sorry I never asked," she said softly. "I'm sorry I never gave you away to she," I replied. She reached for my hand, held it tight. And in that moment, I realized the story had never been about being hidden. It had always been about choosing the moment to be seen. I spent 15 years in shadows. I never asked for revenge. I only ever wanted to be remembered. If you've ever felt invisible to the people you love, if you've ever kept your strength quiet just to survive, then maybe like me you understand that silence isn't the absence of a story. It's the weight of one waiting to be heard. Have you ever carried something alone because you thought no one would believe it? Has your truth ever been too quiet for the world to notice? Until one person finally did. If this story touched something in you, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear where you're listening from or what part reminded you of your own strength. And if you believe that stories like this deserve to be told, please subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with us. There are more voices like mine, more women reclaiming their place in the story, more quiet heroes just waiting to be seen. You're not alone. You were never alone. And the next story might just be yours.